I want to talk a little bit more about those early days.
Yeah.
There has been an evolution of the company. Originally it was to help military families and service members. It's called Troop Swap.
Yep.
Right, and it's evolved several times since then with different names. What were all the names, and kind of how did you make the decisions to change over time to what now is a much bigger opportunity?
Yeah, you got it. So when we first started, the initial concept was you got this very trusted community. This is still at business school, right? We're just kind of really canvassing out the space. You got this incredibly tight-knit social group, and they have no way to interact online. And then we actually looked at Craigslist originally, so we were like, hey, Craigslist hasn't been disrupted in forever. We actually found that Craigslist didn't serve a lot of military bases. They were actually markets that they had neglected. So secondary and tertiary markets underserved this community that is sort of always moving and in need of connecting. And we thought, hey, maybe that'd be a really neat opportunity. So that's why the name was Troop Swap. We had a prototype that we built during business school, one of 5 classes, so just kind of very much in the spare time and weekends. And we went out to USA and to military.com, and we said, hey, look, here's the idea. We would love for you guys to distribute this. We would white label it so that all of your members could use it, and then that'll get us the distribution and help us build the content that we would need. And then who knows, we'll see where it goes from there and see if we've got something. So I had a great meeting with the folks at USAA, and so I was really pumped up. And then a month passed, didn't really hear anything, and I reached back out and I said, hey guys, like what's going on? What's the plan? And they said, well, really like the idea. Just know that fast for us is 18 months, and typical is like 2 to 3 years. And I had like 4 months of runway or something at the time, and I wasn't willing to risk 2 years of my life to do an experiment that might fail, right? So I said, okay, got it. Well, I said, the one thing, if you guys can't do the distribution thing, is to help us with the verification, because more and more we're finding that that's the first thing that we need to do for any product that's focused on the military, is to verify and keep the platform exclusive. So he said, if you would allow us to have a verification relationship where we could leverage some of the screening that you've done against government records, that would be terrific. And so really activated what our contact at USAA called the shadow IT and shadow procurement groups, because he really believed in the mission and they really believed in the mission. And he said, if we put you through the full weight of the procurement of our $14 billion company, we're just going to crush you, right?
Instead of the 2-year process, it would still have been a long time. Right?
Yeah. It would have been miserable. So and we wouldn't have passed, right? We would have needed crazy insurance policies and all sorts of safeguards that we didn't have.
So you found that champion internally that would kind of go without the normal channels.
Yeah, exactly. So we were able to get that deal done, and then on the back of that, that was really instrumental in helping us raise capital. Daily Deals was hot at the time, so we said, well, one thing that doesn't require network effects and might be an interesting market entry strategy is we become this gated platform for military offers and discounts, and we'll look at the Daily Deals model, and maybe that's a really neat space in this emerging industry that everybody's pumped up about that we can carve out. Well, 3 months later, I'm an analytics guy. I looked at the math on it, and the churn was just unsustainable. You had 2% active unsubscribe rates per month, but then you had 8% passive unsubscribes from lower engagement. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, I don't know what Groupon or Living Social is seeing, but anytime you're at a representative sample, behavior is typically pretty similar, right? So he said, okay, that churn rate just to replace and to break even on revenue, not to mention grow it, would cost a tremendous amount of money and would only last as long as investors are willing to pay for it. So fortunately, around that time, it was Under Armour, Microsoft, Bed Bath & Beyond. All of them said, hey, the identity aspect of what you're doing is really, really interesting. They're like, the marketing thing, not so much. You guys are really small, and maybe later as you grow, but let's talk about the identity piece. They said if you build a web service or an API that we could integrate, that's really, really interesting to us, and we would actually put that onto our website into our checkout flow. And that's where things got really interesting. So we said, okay, well, we're going to call the military ID Troop ID for that group, and we're going to see what we got. So we built basically a single sign-on, uses OAuth 2.0 the same way that Facebook Connect does. The VA in a pilot integrated us, which is kind of funny. The VA was using us to verify veterans. Telluride Ski Resort and Under Armour, and that was in November of 2012. So just, from the pivot in late 2011 to building out this web service and to getting, Under Armour integrated and these other brands integrated took a full year. And actually the day before launch is probably the scariest point of the journey, because if that had failed, it was over.
Let's talk about how you got Under Armour. So you guys were still a startup at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, in companies like Microsoft, the VA, Under Armour, how did you convince a company that big and that protective of its brand that they could trust you and that they wanted to work with you? How did you even get on their radar screen to start with?
Well, first, it wasn't me. There was a lot of folks who bought into the mission about what we were trying to do, and I just happened to be the standard bearer for it. So I want to make that clear, but I did hustle my ass off, right? And you get out there, and if people believe in what you're trying to do, the cool thing about America is that they will open up doors for you and they will help. So in our case, a guy named Pete Distad, who's now the SVP, runs Apple TV, which just launched recently. He knew Scott Plank, and he said, "Hey Scott, you guys have always been passionate about serving the military, and I know that was a big break for Kevin. You should talk to IDMe." Or it was TroopSwap at the time, and that was April of 2012, and in November, right before the crazy holiday season, they integrated us into their cart, which still feels a bit like a Jedi mind trick. I don't know how that happened, but it was awesome.
So once you get a couple of those on board, then it's easier to get the next one.
Right, because it's a network effects play. So we signed up, 48,000 users in 45 days, just with those three folks. And I was like, okay, well that's product market fit. And then with an increasing user base and with Under Armour as a reference account, it's a lot easier to close. Overstock, who's the next major brand, to come on board. And then from there, it just kept going. So now we're TaylorMade, Adidas Golf, NASCAR, UFC. I mean, it's so much easier to close when you've got the users and you've got really happy partners who are consuming your technology, who can speak favorably to their peers. But yeah, that first one was literally just you're just chucking Hail Marys when you're when you're new.
Well, and now 3 years after that, as you showed us, there's this kind of hockey stick growth going on now. What is exactly driving that growth?
Yeah, so we're the only way to get access to these benefits, right? So like SeaWorld gives free tickets to active duty military families and 50% off. If you want to get access to that online, you have to sign up for IDMe in order to do that. And that's actually good for them, because if there was a competing network, it would actually be creating more friction for them, right? You could have duplicate identities on different networks where they're taking advantage of the same offer over and over again, right? So they actually
created a monopoly for yourself here?
That's a dangerous word. I don't have to be super careful of it now, but we've created network effects in the same way that a lot of large companies like PayPal and Craigslist have created network effects around our model. So I think the right way to think about when we have a direct relationship with a customer, we're really a wallet, but we're not focused on payments at all yet. We're focused on identity. So you could have Troop ID in your wallet, Student ID, different membership groups. So if you have the PTA or AAA or AARP ID or Gov ID, whatever. But then you can use your login of choice. So if you logged in with Twitter or with PayPal or with LinkedIn or with Facebook, those networks are blind to the attributes, but we know that they're associated. So you could effectively use Facebook as your student ID online.
So you mentioned a few different ways you interact with the government. I mean, the service you provide is something a lot of people would assume the government would do, right? Is just verifying identity.
Yeah.
But you're a startup that's different. You're not a consumer facing, or in some ways you are, but you interact with the government in a lot of different ways. How does that work, right? I mean, what are the things you've learned about that? What can other entrepreneurs learn from that? And,
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that it's repeatable. The only thing, my maxim is never trust government, right? I don't trust government for anything, right? So government made a deliberate decision where they said, we're not going to provide a national ID card. They're like, American citizens just would not, for the same reasons, folks are concerned about NSA surveillance and, having one ID to track all the activity. Just Americans don't want to do it. And by the way, I think healthcare.gov was like an $800 million project. I mean, that's for a website, right? Not to mention this huge distributed architecture that you would need to build if you were going to do this right. So So what the government says, we will establish standards for different confidence levels that credentials can exist at, and we'll let commercial issuers issue those credentials and compete with one another, and we'll let the private sector come up with more efficient models than the government could do in a top-down fashion. So actually, hats off to them because the approach is sound. The issue is that a lot of it goes off the rails because some of the technical and policy controls that are written are too prescriptive. You have people who have decided what the perfect solution for digital identity is and then try to force you into that in key roles. And so we've had to sort of weave our way in and out. But the government, for timing is completely unreliable. And so once you're in, if you're key infrastructure and you're wedded to access to all of their apps, you're in a wonderful position, right? But getting in is really, really difficult. You've got stakeholders who are doing their own identity for that agency who don't want to give it up, and you've got all sorts of entrenched interests that you have to overcome. So we deliberately attacked the commercial side first because we said we can build a profitable business here, and we can sort of tread water. And as an American it sucks, but as the Russians and Chinese keep kicking our ass with all these breaches, these commissioners and agency heads are getting tired of going in front of Congress. And so something that I'm sure the military guys know, like the only way to fight a network is with a network. I don't care how big your silo is. If you continue to fight a network with a silo, you're going to get your ass kicked. So as that has happened, it's created a tremendous amount of political pressure, and we're sort of just waiting in the wings, building up a bigger and bigger network of relying parties. So when the choice does become active on the IRS and Social Security and so forth, the value of an ID card is in its portability, right? And if you're a government contractor that's only focused on the government, too bad. We're already in employment, nonprofits, retail, you name it. So, would you use a credential that you already have that's far more valuable, or would you create a new one that's a single sign-on only for this website? I'm willing to take the bet that you'll do the former.
So this is essentially a national identity card for anybody who wants to be online in this way.
National identity gateway is how I would position it, because there will be choice as to who provides the identity, and we'll enable that, right? So if you want Citibank to be your ID card provider, we'll help you do that. But we will be the hub, just like Visa and MasterCard, enables merchants. I don't care if this card is issued by Chase or by some community bank for first responders, right? As long as it says Visa, I know that I'm going to get paid at a certain time and that this institution meets these operating rules. And so we want to do the same thing for identity.
So you're attacking an incredibly complex problem, right? And I guess maybe part of the way you've gotten here is by not starting with the whole thing, right? You started maybe with a piece of it. If you were starting again, would you even go after this big problem, or would you start after it earlier than you did? How does somebody get started when they're interacting with all these different groups and trying to solve something this crazy?
It's really difficult to prove a counterfactual or to prove a negative. I mean, it's really hard to know. Sometimes I'm very grateful for whatever course we did set that led us to right here, because it's really, really fun. But there were some things that we did fundamentally right, which was that we listened to feedback, we iterated, and we didn't have any preconceptions. So Andrew Nash, who ran identity for Google, came up to some members of our team, and he said, "You guys are the first identity company that I've ever seen that can actually fix digital identity for the internet and make it work the way that it should work." And he goes, and part of the reason that's the case is because we've all been going to talk to the CIOs and the CISOs and everything else about our security and our authentication tool, because you guys went to the marketing department, right? He's like, none of us even thought to do that, right? So he's like, hats off. And because consumers care about affinity and they care about incentives that are meaningful to them, it's really hard to get consumers to take action at scale about security and privacy, right? Even if folks are anxious about it, it's kind of diffused, right? It's not acute where they'll actually take an action to solve it. So by going to marketing, that was the thing that we did really right. I think the things that we could have done better certainly would be to run experiments faster. I mean, that's where I still read as much as I can about Steve Blank and Eric Ries and all these clever ways that they hack these experiments, and they can literally save you a quarter or two of your life and of burn, right, to run an experiment to get to the same learning. And if I kick myself, and if you guys are starting a technology company, there's for whatever reason there's always an inclination to build your own thing, especially your engineers will want to build their own thing. But it's really good to develop habits where you say, let's test it first, even if it's some hack together solution. If we can get it into the market, in 2 weeks instead of in a quarter, and we can figure out if this is something that we should build or not. Those are the types of things where I'm like, man, am I like a year and a half behind where we could be if we'd taken a more efficient approach in some cases?
No business plan survives first contact with a
No,
customer, right?
no, it does not. So you shouldn't.
You might have learned that in a different
You
context.
shouldn't build the Maginot
Yeah.
Line. Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of companies are going after customer. There's kind of the traditional consumer plays and such. You're in a complicated industry. How is it different for you than it would be for other companies that aren't facing the same kind of regulatory and government control and all that?
Well, I would say our growth is very difficult to model. It's how do you model network effects, right? It's really difficult. The IRS, for instance, had 17 million people sign up for their Get Transcript app in 90 days. And now it's just us and Verizon that are being integrated as federated options. And so that's tremendously exciting. It also makes it difficult to raise capital and everything else. In some sense, you can still use instruments like convertible debt to get around some of those problems, right? But you literally have these binary events. And the biggest thing is that even though we're in a great position, keeping up with that kind of scale, it'll make the VA alone would take us from 3 to 5 to 20 to 25,000 new users per day. The IRS triples to quadruples that rate, right? So you need call center support, you need DevOps, and you potentially need it overnight. So I think those are some of the things that this is the next set of challenges that we have to get ready for is you be ready for what you asked for and for everything else, and make sure that you can scale to keep up with the growth. And so those are the types of things. I think there's other I'm almost jealous at times of steady kind of growth startups where you figure out your unit economics, what it costs you to acquire a customer, you can what's my saturation point for channels, and you can kind of go through and pull your different levers. We're much different because we are constantly trying to get into more checkout flows and to get into government agencies for single sign-on, and sales is a really messy thing to predict. Even if you do know your average close times and everything else, I mean you could have a government shutdown that totally puts the government plans on the back burner for 2 quarters.
That never happens. Yeah, it sounds. I'm sure there are plenty of those other companies though that would love to see your growth rate without the marketing spend, right? You've been able to cut that down. That's enough.
We don't spend
Sales into
anything on advertising.
Big accounts now, right? And
That's right.
They drive the growth.
That's right, yeah. We focus all of our marketing on B2B because they drive everything. And it's the portability concept. The more merchants you get, the more attractive you are to membership groups, the more attractive you are to your existing users because your ID card's more useful. The more users you're signing up because everyone coming through their flow for whatever affinity. So like J.Crew would be a great brand for us to get because they do 15% off every day for students and teachers. So if we become their student ID, teacher ID in the checkout flow, that would lead to huge user acquisition for us if that's the only way to get it. And we already do that for Major League Baseball and a bunch of others. So to my mind, it's a matter of time. Eventually we get enough students enrolled where it's like, why wouldn't you do this? And anecdotally, half of the companies I've pitched, they're like these 30-year-old women who are executives who are like, you're going to keep me from getting my J.Crew discount? They're like, I still use
Using
my
their student discount?
Yeah, they're still using their card. So they're getting they're getting ripped off whether they know it or not.
Yeah, I might use mine for the movie theaters occasionally.
Yeah.
All right. I have a couple more questions, and then I want our students to jump in here. So was there a point throughout any of this where you got concerned about regulations? Was there a chance that somebody, a policymaker or an agency would try to change things in a way that would make it really hard for you? And how do you manage the regulatory risk?
Yeah, I think, so regulations are interesting. You can often, people interpret them in different ways, right, for what you can do. And I found it's more often a function of the personality of the individual that you're dealing with, right, and what their thoughts are. So the most frustrating part to me sometimes I hear well, we can't release personal data, even if they have the digital driver's license equivalent where folks can access that data. They won't release it to you, the citizen, right? And the rationale, is usually we can't trust them to do that because they're not smart enough to avoid phishing, or this is our data and not the citizens' data, right? So I think some of those mindsets are really tough. On the regulatory side, there's always the danger that, especially with all this Snowden stuff and NSA stuff, that the government inadvertently passes legislation around privacy that actually harms the very thing that could fix it from the bottom up, which is our network, which doesn't allow for surveillance, but puts people back in control of their data. So I'm very worried about legislation where maybe second and third order effects aren't contemplated. So one example of where that actually happened, which is awful, we had 2 financial institutions with combined 90 million credentials that were going to be part of our bid for Connect.gov. And literally 24 hours, the Obama administration issued an executive order on labor. And that executive order said if you're a government contractor or subcontractor that makes over $500,000, you lose all these arbitration protections in labor disputes, right? Which of course every financial institution had. So both of them, like an hour apart, called and said, we can't do this anymore because we haven't even had a chance to assess the impact here, but it would violate all of our HR policies. We need to completely overhaul what we're doing in order to participate, because we're certainly going to cross that $500,000 threshold. So that was pretty awesome. Michael Daniels over at the White House, and it was we reached out to our contacts and said, you might want to let him know that this executive order on labor just cut off the Obama administration's cybersecurity initiative at the knees, where citizens now can't use their financial logins to access government websites. And I'm sure, I know for a fact, they didn't intend to do that,
Right.
but that's what they did. And so you have to deal with crap like that.
And so you reached out to folks there. Did you get it changed? Or?
I think it's going to take legislation to get it changed,
Okay.
honestly, because that ship's already sailed. It's really, especially for financial institutions, it'd be really politically difficult to say oh, this applies to everyone but Wall Street banks in this climate. So, we just happen to be at the intersection of some rough tides.
All right. Well, I got a couple of questions that are kind of taking a step back from the specifics of ID.me and more about just being an entrepreneur in general. I know you've led troops in battle. You've led your startup through some tough times, but some good times too. What are the similarities and differences between your military experience and your entrepreneurial experience?
So I think the similarities are that you have to have a strong mission, and that was really the core thing for me. In the military, you didn't have to worry about the cause that was bigger than you. Why am I getting up in the morning? Wonderful bond with my guys. I still miss that tremendously. So the mission was first. It was solving something meaningful for the military, and then when we got that feedback and we realized, oh, holy crap, all of digital identity is broken and we've actually found a way to enter this market. That was a super, super exciting moment. But we got lucky, just stumbled into that. It started with a passion for a community that we cared about. As far as what's different is that in the military you have a team. You have other people who are carrying the load, and you've got all sorts of resources and everything else. You take all of that for granted. You very quickly realize, especially the first year of being an entrepreneur is incredibly difficult. You're literally defying gravity through the sheer force of your will. You're raising money, you're hiring people, you're doing customer interviews, you're trying to put a product together, you're iterating the vision, you're doing all the regulatory and admin crap, keeping the books. It is really, really hard. That's why it's great to have at least one co-founder who complements you, in a good way to help lighten that load. And so that's the part that's different, is that you have to build your own team in addition to solving the problem. And in the military, at least X is solved for. You just have to worry about Y. So, yeah.
Great. Well, my last question for this part is about kind of how entrepreneurship fits into your life overall, right? You've been at this company now for a few years. You've also you got married, have a kid. Kind of how does it all fit together?
Yeah, you should ask my wife. Sure, she'd love to field it, because my wife's a physician, so she works as well. But it's really difficult. I would say it's really important to have people that you trust that can increase and give you leverage, so that you can focus on the things that you do best. I'm probably the most relaxed now that I've been in the last 5 years that we've been doing this, but it still is incredibly time consuming. I just found ways now to to balance out my life a little bit. So I always spend from 6 to 8, 8:30 with my little girl every morning, and then I come back on Mondays and Wednesdays at 4 o'clock to pick her up. I still work late, but then I've time with my wife around dinner time and everything else where we can spend some time together when we're both back from work. But it's really, really hard. I have a lot of respect for folks who are parents who become entrepreneurs, because I mean that's just one more thing. You can't tell a kid who's like less than 4 to leave you alone so you can focus on your business for a while. Like that time has got to be allocated to them, right? So that's just one more thing that I have a lot of respect for folks who are able to balance that. But the most important thing is getting people that you trust, because if you don't, you're going to do it all yourself. And that's just a miserable way. The hero approach is a miserable way to sort of go about building a company anyway. So my biggest piece of advice is find people that you really trust. And if you ever find yourself where you're doing somebody else's job and they're not helping make your life easier, you probably hired the wrong person, or they're not a good culture fit. And it's always better to move fast. In fact, it's worse not to fire people when that's the case, because then the breakup is worse down the line. It's sort of like dating. When you know that it's not going to work out, the worst thing that you can do is like stay in that relationship for like a year or two more, because then it's just going to be, families are involved. I mean, it's just messy. So it's literally the same way with work, and you can tell when you have good managers around you who are handling problems, and you're like, hey, I'm worried about this, and like, I already took care of that, or something about the culture is going on, and you've got somebody who's already like working to solve it. I mean, it's an awesome feeling. So you can really focus on, if you're the CEO, raising money, setting the strategic vision, and hiring great folks. I mean, that's really what you do.
Great.